Her best friend was a bear, but then something shocking happened. The early morning sun spilled golden light over the small Australian town of Warrtabeen, where the scent of fresh bread and strong coffee drifted from the bakery on Main Street. Inside, Charlie Anderson moved with practiced ease, her hands dusted with flour as she worked the dough, shaping it into neat rows of rolls. The oven hummed, the warmth contrasting with the crisp autumn air that seeped in every time the door swung open. Customers trickled in, exchanging pleasantries, some lingering to chat, others hurrying off to work. But as Charlie moved through her routine, her thoughts were already miles away, past the winding roads, beyond the thick eucalyptus trees, deep within the wildlife sanctuary where Bruno awaited her. Bruno had not always been part of Charlie's life, but from the moment she had met him, she felt something shift inside her. He was a sun bear, smaller than the massive grizzlies and black bears seen in other parts of the world, but no less impressive. His sleek black fur gleamed under the sun, a stark contrast to the golden crescent-shaped marking on his chest. His eyes, deep and intelligent, followed her every movement when she visited, curiosity and recognition growing with each encounter. Most bears, even those raised in captivity, remained wary of humans, but Bruno had always been different. He had been taken from the illegal wildlife trade as a cub, rescued from a grim future of exploitation. The sanctuary had given him safety, but it could never give him the life he was meant to have in the wild. The bell above the bakery door chimed again, pulling Charlie back to the present. She glanced up to see Zoe, her best friend, standing there arms crossed, an amused smirk playing on her lips. "You're thinking about him again, aren't you?" Zoe teased, stepping behind the counter and stealing a croissant from the cooling tray. "You've got that dreamy, faraway look. Honestly, it's like you've got a crush on a bear." Charlie rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a smile. "Shut up, He's special, Zoe. You'd get it if you spent more time with him." Zoe took a bite, chewing thoughtfully. "You know I love animals, but it's a bear, Charlie. A bear. I don't get how you can be so comfortable around him." Charlie wiped her hands on her apron, glancing out the window at the early morning bustle. "It's not about being comfortable. It's about trust. He's not wild. He never had the chance to be. He spent his whole life surrounded by people. I don't think he sees me as a threat. Or maybe he sees you as a particularly tasty-looking friend," Zoe quipped. Charlie laughed, shaking her head. "You sound like the town council. They're already nervous about him staying at the sanctuary long-term. There's talk about relocating him." Zoe raised an eyebrow. "To where?" "That's the problem," Charlie sighed. "There's nowhere else. He can't be released. He wouldn't survive. Sanctuaries are full, and zoos. Well, you know how I feel about that." Zoe's teasing expression softened. "So what are you going to do?" Charlie hesitated, the idea that had been forming in her mind for weeks hovering on the edge of her lips. It was ridiculous, impossible. But wasn't everything impossible until someone made it happen? She took a deep breath. "I want to keep him." Zoe choked on her croissant. "You... what?" "Not here," Charlie said quickly. "Not in town. I mean, I have that land behind my house, the one that backs onto the national park. If I build an enclosure, a proper one, I could give him a home." Zoe stared at her like she'd grown a second head. "Charlie, I love you, but you've lost your mind. You can't just bring home a bear like he's a stray dog." Charlie braced herself. She had expected resistance, but hearing it from Zoe stung more than she cared to admit. "I'm not talking about keeping him in my living room," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "I'd make sure he had space, enrichment, everything he needs. It wouldn't be any different from the sanctuary, except I'd be responsible for him." Zoe shook her head, setting down what was left of her croissant. "You really think the council's going to let you do that? That the town's going to be okay with it? People are already uneasy about him being at the sanctuary. Keeping him this close to town? They'll freak out." Charlie exhaled sharply. "People are uneasy because they don't know him. They hear bear and picture something dangerous. But Bruno isn't dangerous. He's smart, gentle, and he trusts me." Zoe leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. "You really love him, don't you?" Charlie hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I do," Zoe sighed. "All right, let's say, hypothetically, you do manage to convince the town, build this enclosure, get the legal approvals. What then? He's still a bear, Charlie. No matter how much he trusts you, he's still an animal with instincts. What if something happens? Charlie met her gaze, unwavering. Then I take responsibility for it. Look, I know it won't be easy, but I also know that if I don't try, he's going to end up locked away somewhere, miserable for the rest of his life. I can't let that happen. Zoe studied her for a long moment, then sighed, shaking her head with a half smile. You're stubborn as hell, you know that? Charlie grinned. You've mentioned it once or twice. Well, if you're really doing this, you're going to need help, and I assume that means dragging me into it. Charlie's heart lifted. You'd help? Zoe groaned. I can't believe I'm saying this, but yes, I'll help. But only because I know you'll do it with or without me, and someone's got to make sure you don't get eaten. Charlie laughed, relief flooding through her. You're the best. I know, Zoe muttered, stuffing the rest of her croissant into her mouth. Now finish up here so we can go see your oversized pet. Charlie worked faster, anticipation buzzing in her veins. By the time she and Zoe locked up the bakery and drove out toward the sanctuary, the sun had climbed higher, casting warm light over the trees. The sanctuary sat on the edge of the national park, a sprawling stretch of land dedicated to the care and rehabilitation of wildlife. They parked near the entrance, and as soon as Charlie stepped out, she heard it, the familiar deep-chested chuffing sound that signaled Bruno's excitement. She turned toward his enclosure, and there he was, standing on his hind legs, his thick paws gripping the wooden fence. The moment he saw her, he dropped back down and ambled toward her with surprising speed. His small, round ears perked, his dark eyes alight with recognition. Charlie's heart swelled. Hey, big guy, she murmured, stepping closer. Bruno let out a soft huff and pressed his nose against the fence. Without hesitation, Charlie reached through and scratched the thick fur behind his ears, just the way he liked. Bruno leaned into her touch, eyes half closing in contentment. Zoe, standing a few steps back, watched the interaction with an expression that was equal parts awe and disbelief. Okay, she admitted. That is kind of adorable. Charlie grinned, glancing at her best friend before turning back to Bruno. This is just the beginning, she whispered. I promise I'm going to find a way to keep you safe. Charlie stood by Bruno's enclosure, her fingers threading absent-mindedly through the metal fence as the sun bear nosed at her hand, his broad tongue swiping over her knuckles in a lazy, affectionate gesture. The late afternoon light filtered through the eucalyptus trees, casting dappled shadows on Bruno's glossy black coat. He huffed softly, a deep, rumbling sound that Charlie had come to recognize as his way of expressing contentment. She smiled, but the weight of uncertainty pressed heavily against her chest. She had made her decision, to fight for Bruno, to give him a home where he wouldn't be locked behind bars for the rest of his life. But now came the hard part, convincing everyone else. You know this isn't going to be easy, right? Zoe said from behind her, arms crossed as she leaned against the wooden railing. She had been unusually quiet since they arrived at the sanctuary, watching Bruno with a wary sort of fascination. I mean, I agreed to help, but I still think you're out of your mind. Charlie let out a breathy laugh, rubbing the back of her neck. Yeah, I figured, but you also know I'm not giving up. Zoe sighed, shaking her head. No, I know. That's the problem. You'll fight until you collapse, and I'll be the one dragging your exhausted body home. Charlie smirked, nudging Bruno's nose playfully before stepping back from the enclosure. Then I guess we should start figuring out how to win this fight before it kills me. They left the sanctuary as the sun dipped lower, the cool evening breeze rustling through the trees as Charlie drove them back to town. Wartop Bend wasn't big, a single main road lined with small businesses, a few side streets branching off into quiet residential areas, and beyond that, the vast expanse of bushland that stretched toward the mountains. Everyone knew everyone, which was why Charlie wasn't surprised when, the next morning, word had already started spreading about her plans. She hadn't even finished setting up the bakery display when the bell above the door chimed and in walked Mr. Hargrove, the head of the town council. He was a thin, severe-looking man in his late 50s with neatly combed silver hair and the kind of frown that made children straighten their backs in school assemblies. Charlie pasted on her most polite smile. Morning, Mr. Hargrove. What can I get for you?" Mr. Hargrove folded his hands in front of him, his sharp blue eyes scanning the bakery like it was the first time he'd ever stepped foot inside. "I hear you've taken quite the interest in that bear up at the sanctuary." Charlie kept her expression neutral as she stacked fresh loaves of sourdough on the counter. "Bruno? Yeah, I've been volunteering there for a while now." Mr. Hargrove pursed his lips. "Word is you're planning on taking him in, keeping him on your property." Charlie paused, meeting his gaze. "That's right." His frown deepened. "You do realize how dangerous that sounds?" "He's not dangerous," Charlie said evenly. "He's been around people his whole life. He's not some wild animal that's going to start attacking people." Mr. Hargrove scoffed. "He's a bear, Miss Anderson." "A bear? And you want to bring him into our town like he's a house pet?" Charlie took a slow breath, steadying herself. "I want to build a proper enclosure for him, outside of town on my property. He wouldn't be roaming the streets." Mr. Hargrove shook his head. "The council won't approve it." "Then I'll petition." Mr. Hargrove's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something like amusement crossing his face before it hardened again. "You really think you'll get enough support?" Charlie set down the loaf of bread she had been holding, standing a little taller. "I think that once people actually hear the truth about Bruno, see what he's really like, they'll understand why he deserves a home, and why he deserves better than being locked in a cage for the rest of his life." Mr. Hargrove studied her for a long moment before letting out a sigh. "You're stubborn, I'll give you that. But you're fighting an uphill battle, Miss Anderson." He turned toward the door, pausing only briefly before adding, "I suggest you think long and hard before wasting your time." The door swung shut behind him, and Charlie clenched her fists, frustration buzzing under her skin. Zoe, who had been pretending to stock the pastry case, let out a low whistle. "Well, that went about as well as expected." Charlie huffed, pressing her palms against the counter. "I knew they'd be against it, but I didn't think they'd be so quick to dismiss the idea." "They're scared," Zoe said simply. "A bear isn't exactly a small ass, Charlie. You're going to have to work twice as hard to convince them you can handle this." Charlie nodded, determination solidifying in her chest. "Then that's exactly what I'll do." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of research, planning, and community outreach. Charlie spent every spare moment drafting proposals, reaching out to wildlife specialists, and gathering support. She spoke to people in town, trying to dispel their fears and show them that Bruno wasn't some dangerous predator lurking in their midst. Some listened, others, not so much. "You're insane," one woman had scoffed at the grocery store when Charlie brought it up. "What happens when that thing gets too big for you to handle?" "He's already full grown," Charlie had replied evenly, "and I handle him just fine." "Until you don't." Reactions like that weren't uncommon, but Charlie refused to let them discourage her. Instead, she leaned on the people who did support her, like the sanctuary staff, who vouched for Bruno's temperament, and a few of the town's younger residents, who were excited by the idea rather than afraid of it. But just when she thought she was making progress, a setback struck. One evening, Charlie arrived at the sanctuary only to find the gate to Bruno's enclosure open. Panic shot through her veins as she ran toward it, her breath coming fast. Inside, Bruno was pacing restlessly, his ears twitching as he sniffed the air. His food bowl was overturned, and there were signs of disturbance in the dirt. Someone had been here. Someone had tried to let him out. Zoe arrived minutes later to find Charlie kneeling by the enclosure, checking the lock. "What happened?" Charlie exhaled shakily. "Someone tried to release him." Zoe's expression darkened. "You think it was someone from town?" Charlie nodded, her stomach twisting. "Someone who wants to prove he's dangerous." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of it pressing between them. Zoe finally broke it. "Then we proved them wrong." Charlie swallowed hard, looking up at Bruno. He stared back at her, his deep, knowing eyes reflecting something she couldn't quite put into words. She reached through the fence, brushing her fingers over his thick fur. "Yeah," she whispered, "we do." The tension in Warta Bend simmered just beneath the surface, lurking in the wary glances of townspeople and the whispered conversations that hushed whenever Charlie entered a room. Ever since the attempted break-in at the sanctuary, The fear surrounding Bruno had only grown, fueled by rumor and speculation. Some said it was a warning that someone had done it to prove how dangerous he was. Others suggested it was an act of sabotage, meant to force the sanctuary to close before Charlie could make any progress on her petition. Either way, it was clear that not everyone in town wanted Bruno to stay. Charlie spent the following days reinforcing security at the sanctuary, working with the staff to install new locks and cameras while making sure Bruno remained safe. But the unease followed her, manifesting in the subtle shift in tone whenever she spoke to people about her plans. Even those who had once been neutral now hesitated, afraid of drawing attention to themselves by openly supporting her. It was exhausting, frustrating, and at times disheartening, but Charlie refused to let it deter her. One evening, as she closed up the bakery, Zoe appeared at the door, her arms crossed, in an expression that told Charlie she had news she wouldn't like. "I just overheard Mr. Hargrove talking at the pub," Zoe said without preamble. "He's planning on calling a town meeting to officially block your petition before it even reaches the council. Says it's a public safety issue." Charlie exhaled sharply, running a flour-dusted hand through her hair. "Of course he is. He doesn't even want people to consider it." Zoe nodded. "If the council shuts it down now, you won't get another chance for months, maybe longer." Charlie clenched her fists, anger bubbling in her chest. "Then we need to change the conversation before that meeting happens." Zoe raised an eyebrow. "And how exactly do we do that?" Charlie thought for a moment, then grabbed her phone. "We show people who Bruno really is." Within the hour, Charlie and Zoe were at the sanctuary, standing outside Bruno's enclosure as the sky darkened. The sanctuary had closed for the day, the last of the staff gone home, leaving them alone with the sounds of the bush humming softly in the distance. Bruno sat inside his enclosure, watching them with mild curiosity, his massive frame relaxed, unbothered by their presence. Charlie unlocked her phone and flipped the camera to record. "Hey everyone," she began, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I know there's been a lot of talk about Bruno lately. A lot of fear, a lot of misinformation. So I wanted to show you the truth." She stepped closer to the fence, extending her hand through the gap. Bruno lumbered forward, his movements slow and deliberate. He sniffed her fingers before gently nudging her palm with his nose, his warm breath puffing against her skin. She scratched behind his ears and Bruno let out a low, rumbling sound of contentment. "This is the bear people are afraid of," Charlie said, keeping the camera steady. "This is the animal some people think is too dangerous to have near town. But look at him. He's not a monster. He's not a threat. He's just Bruno." She turned the camera to Zoe, who hesitated before stepping closer. "I'll admit, I was scared of him at first," Zoe said. "I mean, come on, he's a bear." But then I actually got to know him and I realized Charlie was right. He's not scary. He's just a big, weird dog. Charlie laughed and even Bruno huffed in what almost seemed like agreement. She turned the camera back to herself. "I know keeping him here is a big ask. I know it's not what people are used to. But he deserves better than to be locked up somewhere he doesn't belong. I just hope people can see that before it's too late." She ended the recording and exhaled. "Well, that was either a great idea or a terrible one." Zoe smirked. "Only one way to find out." They uploaded the video that night, and by morning it had spread through town like wildfire. Some people were surprised to see Bruno acting so docile. Others remained skeptical, but the conversation had shifted. Instead of whispers about the dangers of keeping a bear, there were discussions about the possibility of making it work. Not everyone was convinced, but at least they were listening. But not everyone was happy about it. A few days later, Charlie arrived at the bakery early, only to find a note taped to the door. The message was scrawled in thick, jagged letters. "Keep the bear or keep your business. Not both." Her stomach twisted as she tore it down, anger and fear swirling inside her. This wasn't just about Bruno anymore. Someone was trying to scare her into giving up. Zoe arrived moments later, her face darkening when she saw the note in Charlie's hands. "This is getting out of control." Charlie's grip tightened around the paper. "I'm not backing down." "I know you're not," Zoe said, "but you need to be careful. Whoever did this isn't just annoyed. They're serious." Charlie swallowed hard, shoving the note into her pocket. Then we make sure we're more serious. The days leading up to the town meeting were a blur of preparations. Charlie gathered signatures, spoke to anyone who would listen, and made sure her video continued circulating. The sanctuary staff backed her, offering their expertise to address concerns, and slowly support began to grow. The night of the meeting, the town hall was packed, the air thick with tension. Mr. Hargrove stood at the front, his expression smug as he called for order. "We're here tonight to discuss a matter of public safety," he announced. "I understand there are strong opinions on both sides, but we must consider what is best for our community." Charlie stood as murmurs rippled through the crowd. She walked to the front, meeting Mr. Hargrove's gaze before turning to address the room. "What's best for our community," she said, "is making decisions based on facts, not fear." She pulled out a stack of papers, placing them on the table. "I have over 200 signatures in favor of allowing Bruno to stay under proper conditions. I have expert testimony from sanctuary staff confirming that he poses no threat when properly cared for. And I have a plan in place for his long-term welfare. This isn't reckless, it's responsible." Murmurs spread through the room, some voices in agreement, others still uncertain. Mr. Hargrove frowned. "And what about the risk? What happens if something goes wrong?" Charlie took a deep breath. "Then I take responsibility. But I refuse to let fear dictate this town's decisions. Bruno is part of this community, whether we acknowledge it or not. The question isn't if we can keep him safe. It's if we're willing to try." Silence filled the room. Then slowly a voice spoke up. "I've seen the videos," an older woman near the back said, "and I think she's right." A few heads nodded. Others exchanged glances. The shift was small, but it was there. Mr. Hargrove pursed his lips. "The council will review the proposal and make a decision." Charlie held her breath as the meeting adjourned. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. As she stepped outside, Zoe clapped her on the back. "I think you just gave them something to think about." Charlie exhaled, looking up at the night sky. "Now we wait." The days after the town meeting were an agonizing blur of waiting. Every time Charlie stepped into the bakery, she was met with the same hushed conversations, the same curious glances, the same unspoken question in the air. Had the council made their decision? She tried to distract herself with work, kneading dough, shaping loaves, serving customers with a smile that felt increasingly forced. But the uncertainty clung to her, a constant weight pressing against her ribs. Even Zoe, usually quick with a joke or sarcastic remark, seemed restless, checking her phone every few minutes as if expecting news to break at any moment. The town was divided. Some people had begun to warm to the idea of Bruno staying, their fears tempered by the video Charlie had posted. Others remained adamantly opposed, muttering about liability, safety, and what would happen if the bear ever turned. And then there were those who saw Bruno as nothing more than a nuisance, an unnecessary problem in a town that had gotten along just fine without him. Mr. Hargrove and his supporters fell firmly into that category, and Charlie had no doubt they were doing everything in their power to shut her down behind closed doors. On the third morning after the meeting, Charlie found another note waiting for her when she arrived at the bakery. This one wasn't taped to the door. It was slipped through the mail slot, lying on the floor just inside. She picked it up with a sinking feeling, her pulse quickening as she unfolded the paper. "Enough is enough. Get rid of the bear or we'll do it for you." Charlie stared at the words, her hands tightening around the page. The bluntness of the threat sent a chill down her spine. Before, the notes had been vague warnings, intimidation tactics meant to make her second-guess herself. This was different. This was a promise. The bell above the door jingled as Zoe walked in, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She took one look at Charlie's expression and frowned. "What now?" Wordlessly, Charlie handed her the note. Zoe read it, her face darkening. "Okay, this is officially past the point of angry townspeople and into serious psychopath territory." Charlie exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers to her temples. "I need to tell the sanctuary." Zoe nodded. "And the cops." Charlie hesitated, but she knew Zoe was right. As much as she hated the idea of escalating things, ignoring a direct threat wasn't an option. "Yeah," she said finally, "the cops too." By noon, she was sitting in the tiny, sparsely decorated office, of Officer Paul Deacon, the town's senior police officer. He was a grizzled man in his late 50s, with a perpetually tired expression and a voice like gravel. He read the note twice before setting it down on his desk and pinning Charlie with a weary look. "You have any idea who might have sent this?" Charlie shook her head. "Number, but I have a pretty good idea of who wants Bruno gone." Deacon sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Look, Charlie, I get it. You care about the bear, but this situation is riling people up. You're making a lot of folks nervous, and nervous people do stupid things." Charlie felt her temper flare. "So what? I should just give up? Let them win?" Deacon held up a hand. "I didn't say that. I just want you to understand the position you're in. Whoever sent this, they mean business, and I can't exactly station an officer at the sanctuary 24/7. Charlie swallowed hard, feeling the weight of what he wasn't saying. If something happened to Bruno, if someone decided to take matters into their own hands, there was only so much law enforcement could or would do. Deacon exhaled and leaned back in his chair. "I'll file a report. Not much else I can do without proof, but at least it's on record." Charlie nodded, though it didn't feel like much of a reassurance. When she returned to the sanctuary later that afternoon, the staff was already on high alert. The head caretaker, a wiry man named Peter, met her at the entrance, his expression grim. "We're doubling up security checks," he said, "locking everything down at night, and we're setting up a night patrol schedule." Charlie felt a rush of gratitude. "Thank you," she said, meaning it. Peter nodded. "We take care of our own." But even with the increased security, Charlie couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. And 2 nights later, her fears were confirmed. It was nearly midnight when her phone rang, jolting her awake. She groggily reached for it, blinking at the screen. "Peter." Her stomach clenched as she answered. "What's wrong?" "Someone's here," Peter said, his voice low but urgent. "They're trying to break into Bruno's enclosure." Charlie was out of bed and pulling on her boots before he finished the sentence. "Did you call the cops?" "Already did, but I don't know if they'll get here in time." Charlie's heart pounded as she grabbed her keys and ran for her truck. The drive to the sanctuary was a blur of headlights and adrenaline. By the time she skidded to a stop outside the main entrance, Peter was already waiting for her, flashlight in hand. "Come on," he said, motioning for her to follow. They sprinted toward Bruno's enclosure, the night air thick with tension. In the darkness, shadows moved near the fence. Figures, 2, maybe 3, hunched low, working at the locks. The sound of metal scraping against metal sent a spike of fear through Charlie's chest. "Hey!" she shouted, breaking into a full sprint. The figures jolted, one of them cursing under his breath. Flashlights swung toward them, momentarily blinding Charlie before the intruders bolted. Peter took off after them, but they were fast, disappearing into the trees before he could catch up. Breathing hard, Charlie turned toward Bruno's enclosure. The lock had been partially sawed through, the chain hanging loose. Bruno himself was awake, pacing just beyond the fence, his massive frame silhouetted in the dim light. He let out a low, anxious chuff, his ears flicking back as he looked from Charlie to the broken lock. She stepped closer, pressing a hand against the fence. "It's okay, big guy," she murmured. "You're okay." But she knew that wasn't entirely true. Someone had just tried to free him, or worse, and next time, they might not fail. Peter returned a few minutes later, shaking his head. "Lost them," Charlie exhaled sharply. "We need to tell Deacon." Peter nodded, already pulling out his phone. By the time the police arrived, the intruders were long gone, leaving behind nothing but the broken lock and a clear message. They weren't done. Charlie stood by Bruno's enclosure long after the officers had finished taking statements, her hands curled into fists. This wasn't just about fear anymore. This was personal. Someone wanted Bruno gone, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. But Charlie had made a promise, and she wasn't going to let them take him away. Not now, not ever. The next morning, the entire town of Warta Ben was buzzing with the news of the break-in. The sanctuary staff had done their best to downplay the event. But in a town this small, word traveled faster than wildfire in a drought. Theories swirled through the streets, ranging from reckless teenagers playing a prank to something far more deliberate. Charlie barely had time to process what had happened before she was thrown back into the thick of it, arriving at the bakery to find Zoe waiting for her with a deep frown and 2 cups of coffee. Without a word, Zoe handed one over and leaned against the counter, watching Charlie take a long sip before speaking. "All right," Zoe said. "Tell me everything." Charlie let out a tired sigh, running a hand through her hair. They tried to cut through the lock. There were at least 2 of them, maybe 3. They ran when Peter and I got there. But it was close, Zoe. Too close. Zoe's jaw tightened. Did they actually get in? No, but they were trying. Charlie placed her coffee down, rubbing her temples. And if we hadn't gotten there when we did, they might have. Zoe exhaled slowly, drumming her fingers against the counter. This isn't just about the petition anymore. Someone wants to hurt him, Charlie. Charlie nodded, the knot in her stomach tightening. I know. For the rest of the morning, the bakery was unusually quiet. Some customers came in and whispered their sympathies, offering words of encouragement, while others barely met Charlie's eyes, still wary of the situation. And then there were those who lingered just a little too long, their disapproving stares making it clear that they thought this was Charlie's fault, that she had brought this trouble onto the town. She ignored them as best as she could, but the weight of their judgment pressed heavily against her shoulders. By midday, Peter called with an update. "Deacon's looking into it," he said, "but unless someone comes forward, there's not much they can do. No cameras caught their faces, and they left no evidence behind." Charlie clenched her jaw. "So we just wait for them to try again?" Peter hesitated. "We're reinforcing everything today. Double chains, extra guards at night. But Charlie, we can't keep him safe forever if someone is really determined." The words sent a cold wave of fear through her. She swallowed hard, gripping the phone tighter. "Then we make sure no one gets the chance." The next few days were filled with action. Charlie, Zoe, and the sanctuary staff worked tirelessly, installing stronger locks, reinforcing the fences, even bringing in motion-activated floodlights to deter any further break-ins. The police increased their patrols near the sanctuary, but Charlie knew it wasn't enough. Whoever had done this was willing to go to extremes, and that meant it was only a matter of time before they tried again. Meanwhile, the town meeting loomed closer, and Mr. Hargrove wasn't wasting any time making his case against Bruno. Flyers appeared on telephone poles, slipped under doors, posted outside the general store. "Do we want a bear living among us?" The bold letters read, "Before it's too late, say no to the Bruno petition." Charlie ripped one down outside the bakery, her hands shaking with frustration. Zoe snatched another from a nearby post, crumpling it in her fist. "They're turning this into a horror movie," she muttered. "What's next? Bear on the loose? The Waratah Bend massacre?" Charlie didn't laugh. "They're making him into a monster," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "and I don't know how to fight that." Zoe stared at her for a long moment before nodding toward the bakery window. "You do it the same way you always have. You show them the truth." That night, Charlie sat in her small living room, staring at the petition papers spread across the coffee table. She had the signatures, she had the evidence, she had the sanctuary staff backing her. But would it be enough? She thought about Bruno, about the way he trusted her, the way he chuffed in greeting whenever he saw her, the way he leaned into her touch like a giant, overgrown dog. He wasn't dangerous. He wasn't a monster. He was just Bruno. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Peter standing on her porch, looking more serious than she'd ever seen him. "We need to talk," he said. She stepped aside, letting him in. He sat heavily on the couch, rubbing a hand over his face. "Charlie, I think I know who's behind this." Her heart skipped. "Who?" Peter hesitated, then sighed. "A few of the ranchers on the outskirts of town. There's been talk. They're worried about their livestock, even though Bruno's never gone near their land. And Hargrove's been stirring them up, making them think that if they don't do something, they'll wake up one day to find their cattle torn apart." Charlie's stomach twisted. "That's ridiculous. He doesn't hunt. He wouldn't even know how." "Doesn't matter," Peter said. "Fear doesn't need facts." Charlie clenched her fists. "So what do we do?" Peter looked at her, his expression grim. "You need to be ready for the worst at that meeting, Charlie. Because if they turn the crowd against you, if they convince enough people, you could lose him." The words were a gut punch. She swallowed hard, nodding slowly. Then I guess I'll have to convince them first. The night of the meeting, the town hall was packed, the energy tense and charged. Charlie stood at the front, facing a sea of wary, skeptical, and downright hostile faces. Mr. Hargrove stood beside her, his arms crossed, his smirk just barely hidden beneath his carefully neutral expression. He stepped forward first. "Ladies and gentlemen, we all know why we're here," he began. "Miss Anderson wants to bring a fully grown bear into our community. Despite the risks, I think we can all agree that is concerning." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Charlie felt Zoe squeeze her arm, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone. Then it was her turn. She stepped forward, clearing her throat. "I understand why people are scared," she said, "but I also know that fear isn't the same as reality." She turned, gesturing to the projector screen behind her, where she had prepared a slideshow of Bruno. Not just pictures, but videos. Bruno playing, Bruno resting in the sun, Bruno gently taking food from her hand. "This is the bear you're afraid of," she said. "This is the animal some of you think is a monster. But look at him. Does he look dangerous to you?" Silence. Some people shifted uncomfortably. Others looked away. Charlie took a deep breath. "He's not a threat. He's not a killer. He's an animal who has never known the wild, who has never hunted, who has never given anyone in this town a reason to be afraid. The real danger isn't Bruno. It's what happens to him if we don't give him a home," Mr. Hargrove scoffed. "And what happens when he gets bigger, when he decides he doesn't want to be behind a fence anymore?" Charlie met his gaze evenly. "Then I take responsibility. I always have." The room was quiet. Then slowly, someone clapped. Then another, and another. Charlie's breath caught. Maybe, just maybe, it was enough. The council chamber was silent. The murmurs that had once filled the space with uncertainty and skepticism had faded into an uneasy hush as Charlie's words settled over the room. For a moment, all she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat, the weight of everything she had fought for hanging in the air like a held breath. She scanned the faces in the crowd, searching for a sign, any sign, that they had truly listened. Zoe stood near the back, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. But Charlie knew her well enough to catch the flicker of hope in her eyes. Peter sat beside some of the sanctuary staff, his fingers drumming impatiently against the table as he waited for the council to respond. And then there was Mr. Hargrove, standing stiffly at the podium, his lips pressed into a thin line as if he had just swallowed something bitter. The town mayor, an older woman named Margaret Langley, cleared her throat and adjusted her glasses as she leaned toward the microphone. "Miss Anderson," she said, her voice measured, careful, "you've made a compelling case, and I commend your dedication to this animal. However, the concerns raised tonight are not without merit. A bear, no matter how tame, remains a wild creature by nature." Charlie's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to stand tall. "I understand that, ma'am, but Bruno is not wild. He never has been. If he had ever known the jungle, I wouldn't be standing here right now. But he was taken from that life as a cub. He doesn't belong in the wild any more than I do." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Margaret held up a hand to quiet them, her gaze steady on Charlie. "Even so, if we allow this, we set a precedent. We need to be absolutely sure that this is in the best interest of both the town and the animal in question." Charlie swallowed hard. "That's why I've worked with the sanctuary staff to create a detailed proposal for Bruno's care," she said, motioning toward Peter, who promptly handed over a folder filled with documents. "This outlines his living conditions, safety measures, veterinary oversight, and all the legal requirements to ensure his well-being. I'm not asking for blind trust. I'm asking for a chance to prove that this can work." Margaret flipped through the papers, nodding slowly. Mr. Hargrove, however, let out a scoff. "This is absurd," he muttered, shaking his head. "We're really considering this?" Margaret gave him a sharp look. "We're considering everything, Mr. Hargrove." A beat of silence passed, thick with tension. Then she turned back to Charlie. "The council will deliberate and return with a decision by the end of the week." Charlie exhaled, nodding. "Thank you." As the meeting adjourned, people began to disperse in hushed conversations. Some offered Charlie small smiles of encouragement. Others simply avoided her gaze. She felt Zoe slip beside her, bumping their shoulders together. "That was intense," Zoe muttered. "I thought Hargrove was going to burst a blood vessel." Charlie let out a breathy laugh, though her hands were still trembling. "Yeah, but at least they're considering it." Peter clapped a hand on her shoulder. "You did good, Charlie. Now we wait." The next few days were a blur of restless anticipation. Charlie went through the motions at the bakery, but her mind was always elsewhere. Every time her phone buzzed, her heart leapt into her throat, only to plummet when it was just a routine message or a customer order. She visited Bruno every evening, sitting by his enclosure, talking to him like he could somehow offer the reassurance she needed. He didn't understand the weight of what was happening. He only knew that Charlie was there, and that seemed to be enough for him. Then on the 5th day, the call finally came. Charlie stood frozen in the bakery kitchen, flowers still clinging to her hands as she stared at the name on the screen. Margaret Langley. Zoe, who had been kneading dough beside her, noticed the look on Charlie's face and immediately wiped her hands on her apron. "Well, answer it." Charlie took a deep breath, then swiped to accept the call. "Hello?" Margaret's voice was calm but firm. "Miss Anderson, the council has made its decision." Charlie closed her eyes, bracing herself. "We've agreed to grant you a conditional permit for Bruno's care." The words took a moment to register. Then all at once, relief crashed over Charlie like a tidal wave. You're serious?" Margaret chuckled softly. "Yes, I'm serious. There will be strict regulations in place, and you'll be subject to regular check-ins. But yes, you have permission to keep him." Charlie let out a shaky laugh, tears pricking at her eyes. Thank you so much." Margaret's tone softened. "You fought for him, Miss Anderson. That kind of dedication is hard to ignore. Just make sure you prove us right." When the call ended, Charlie turned to Zoe, barely able to contain her grin. "We did it." Zoe blinked. "Wait, really?" Charlie laughed, grabbing her by the shoulders. "We freaking did it." The next few hours were a blur of celebration. Peter and the sanctuary staff cheered when Charlie told them the news, immediately launching into plans to begin construction on Bruno's new home. Supporters who had been quietly rooting for her finally stepped forward, offering to help in any way they could. Even some of the skeptics seemed to begrudgingly accept the outcome, though Mr. Hargrove remained notably silent. A week later, the first post was driven into the ground on Charlie's property, marking the start of Bruno's new life. Over the following months, the enclosure took shape, a sprawling space with reinforced fencing, climbing structures, shaded areas, and plenty of room for Bruno to explore. Charlie spent every free moment overseeing the progress, ensuring every detail met the strict standards set by the council. And then, finally, the day came. The sanctuary staff gathered as Charlie stood outside Bruno's enclosure, her heart pounding as Peter unlocked the gate. Bruno, sensing something different, sniffed the air before stepping forward, his dark eyes flicking curiously between the open gate and Charlie. She knelt, extending her hand. "Come on, big guy," she murmured. "Let's go home." Bruno hesitated only for a moment before lumbering toward her, stepping through the gate and into the transport crate that would take him to his new home. Charlie held her breath as the door was secured, the truck rumbling to life. The drive felt endless, but when they finally arrived at the enclosure, Charlie's chest tightened with emotion. This was it. The gate swung open, and Bruno stepped out onto the grass, his nose twitching as he took in the new scents. He wandered forward, sniffing the trees, the wooden platforms, the soft earth beneath his paws. Then with a deep, satisfied chuff, he flopped onto his back, stretching out in the sun like he had lived there all his life. Charlie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Beside her, Zoe chuckled. "Well, looks like he approves." Charlie wiped at her eyes, grinning. "Yeah, I think he does." As the sun began to set over Wartaben, Charlie watched Bruno settle into his new home, knowing that no matter how hard the fight had been, it had all been worth it. He was safe, he was home, and so was she. At its core, this story is about resilience, compassion, and the power of standing up for what you believe in. Charlie's journey wasn't just about saving a bear. It was about challenging fear with understanding, replacing doubt with hope, and proving that love and dedication can change even the most stubborn minds. Bruno, once seen as a danger, became a symbol of trust and coexistence, reminding us that every creature, no matter how misunderstood, deserves a chance at a good life. This story teaches us that real change doesn't happen overnight, and sometimes the fight to do what's right is met with resistance. But persistence, backed by knowledge and heart, can break down walls of prejudice and fear. Charlie's unwavering belief in Bruno's worth changed not only his future, but also the hearts of those around her. Thank you for watching and being part of this journey. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more inspiring tales of courage, kindness, and the incredible bond between humans and animals, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing these stories to life. See you in the next one.